The World Cup in Qatar is causing quite a bit of political tension. We're seeing political statements about whether or not it's appropriate that Qatar should be hosting the World Cup. And we're seeing fans, national teams, and even players coming out and essentially speaking against the World Cup or speaking against certain conditions in Qatar at the World Cup. Now, some people might look at all of this and consider it strange that football, which is ultimately a sport, is creating this level of political tension around one country, which happens to be the host country this time. Because even though FIFA has desperately tried to keep the politics out of the World Cup, this is one of the most high-profile cases where we have seen politics getting mixed up with the sport of football at the World Cup. But this is not even the most high-profile case. Now, what if I told you that the World Cup has generated far more significant political tensions in the past? What if I told you that two countries have actually gone to war over a game to play at the FIFA World Cup? To break this all down, we have to go back to Central America in the 1960s and talk about two countries that are right next to each other, Honduras and El Salvador. The first thing I want to establish and help you understand is what this period in time was like for these two countries back then, and then set the stage for the rest of the story. So to get this going, you need to understand two things about El Salvador and Honduras back in the 60s. First, in terms of landmass and size, Honduras was and still is 5 times bigger than El Salvador. And this is the second thing. In terms of population in the 60s, El Salvador was much bigger. El Salvador had a population that was nearly 40% larger than Honduras. So basically, El Salvador was an overpopulated but small country, while Honduras was an underpopulated but large country. So think about it. What tends to happen when one country is much larger in terms of size than its neighbors, but has a smaller population? More often than not, history has shown that those neighbors start to come over. By 1969, Salvadorans actually made up 20% of the population of Honduras. And when you have that much of a foreign population, well, things often start to get tricky. And that's exactly what happened here between these two countries. In fact, 2 years before 1969, in 1967, the government of Honduras actually passed a controversial law that allowed it to take over land owned by immigrants and give back to its own citizens. The idea here was perhaps that immigrants had owned too much land and the citizens were missing out. And this was a big deal for Salvadorans because it meant a lot of Salvadorans in Honduras lost their lands and were expelled from Honduras. Essentially, they lost everything. So that's the foundation for this football war. We have two countries with no love lost, with a lot of immigration bad blood between each other, just waiting for something to set off the fireworks. And that thing was a football game. In June of 1969, by a weird twist of fate, Honduras and El Salvador had to play against each other to decide which country was going to play at the FIFA World Cup in 1970, hosted by Mexico. Now, this wasn't a regular qualifying game in the group stages. No. This was a 3-game playoff, the best of 3. Winner takes all. 2 countries, but just one ticket to be at the World Cup in 1970. And if things were intense enough between these two countries, it's worth pointing out that as of 1969, neither Honduras nor El Salvador had ever played in a World Cup. So this was a really crazy mix of national pride against a neighboring country, historical bad blood, football bragging rights, and the first ever historical ticket to play at the World Cup. When there's a lot at stake like this, then things tend to go wrong. And believe me when I say, things really went wrong. So the first game of this 3-game playoff to determine whether Honduras or El Salvador will play at the 1970 World Cup was played on the 8th of June in 1969 in Honduras. The local fans in Honduras did all that they could to make home advantage count, including making the El Salvador team as uncomfortable as possible before the game. And they did this by staying right outside their hotel, making a lot of noise to try to keep them up at night and stop them from getting a good night's sleep. And if you play sports, you know a good night's sleep is a great thing to have if you're going to play a game of football the next day. Now, it's hard to say that it worked, but Honduras made home advantage count and they won that first game 1-0 thanks to a last-minute goal. And of course, it was time to play the second game, the return leg back in El Salvador. This second game took place on the 15th of June in 1969, and Salvadorans obviously learned a trick or two from the Honduras fans because they also tried to make home advantage count by camping outside the hotel of the Honduras team, making a lot of noise and trying to stop them from getting a good night's sleep. But this was a little bit more complex because the second game had a lot riding on it. El Salvador was facing the threat of elimination, and with those tensions high, there were significant fears of fan violence. And so the Honduras team actually ended up getting driven to the stadium in armored cars out of fears that they might be attacked. In the end, all of this pressure may have been too much for Honduras because they lost that return leg by 3-0. Now, remember all of those fears of fan violence before the game? They actually also turned out to be legitimate because there were reports of Honduras fans being beaten as they were leaving the stadium in El Salvador. And on the other hand, there were also reports of Salvadorans being attacked and harassed back in Honduras, resulting in several of them actually fleeing Honduras after that second game. Now, this detail is important. You need to remember it, but I'll come back to it. So imagine all of this tension, right? After 2 games, both teams had won 1 each. That's what set the stage for the third and final game to decide the winner, to decide which of these 2 countries would go on and play at the 1970 World Cup for the first time in their history and essentially win this tussle between 2 countries that were going at each other. So in terms of tension, everything that had been at stake before was now next level. Both teams had won 1 game each. It was a tie. This next game, the third and final game, was basically a final for both of them. So if you're wondering where exactly the third game was going to be played, given all of the craziness and tension that was going on between both countries, it ended up being moved to a neutral venue just to minimize fears and issues around violence. And this venue was poetic because it was Mexico, the country that was going to host the World Cup in 1970 that Honduras and El Salvador were both desperate to play in. Playing in the game in a neutral venue essentially reduced the possibility of fan violence as there would have been in either country. But Mexico was not taking any chances. The Mexican government deployed nearly 2,000 police officers to the stadium just for the game on June 27, 1969. And at the end of it all, it was El Salvador that walked away with a 3-2 win thanks to a last-minute goal by this guy, Mauricio Rodriguez. And that was supposed to be that. The 3 games had been played to the bitter end and El Salvador had secured their ticket to play at the first ever World Cup. But honestly, that was just the beginning. Right after the game, the government of El Salvador announced that it was dissolving all diplomatic ties with Honduras. According to the government in El Salvador, nearly 12,000 Salvadorans had been forced to flee and leave Honduras since that second game of the playoffs because they were constantly being attacked and harassed in Honduras. Now, the government of El Salvador also claimed that Honduras had done nothing at all to stop or even punish these attacks. And so on the 14th of July 1969, 18 days after the third game when both countries went to war on the pitch, El Salvador's military invaded Honduras and kickstarted an actual war. As you would expect, Honduras also had a military response, and this conflict essentially escalated and turned out into an all-out war between both sides. It was a war that lasted for 4 days, or 100 hours, before a ceasefire was ultimately agreed on July 18, 1969. But even though it only lasted for 4 days, this war came at an incredibly great cost, because in total, as many as 3,000 people died on both sides. The majority of those who died turned out to be Honduras citizens because the majority of the war had been fought in Honduras. But it didn't end there. Because even for those who survived, things didn't exactly resolve themselves after the ceasefire. About 300,000 Salvadorans were displaced after the war, and the economies of both countries were obviously impacted significantly. The ceasefire also didn't mean that the 2 countries or the 2 governments suddenly started agreeing with each other. In fact, it was the opposite. Honduras and El Salvador stopped trading with each other even though they were right next to each other. They also closed their land borders, and they had border disputes that carried on for decades afterwards. The political bad blood that existed between both countries resulted in actual blood being spilled because of a war that was triggered by a game to qualify for the FIFA World Cup. Now, nearly a year after the war, El Salvador went on to play at the FIFA World Cup and they made their first ever appearance. But they ended up losing all 3 games without scoring a single goal. And El Salvador didn't play at the World Cup again until 12 years later when, in another weird twist of fate, they actually qualified alongside Honduras, who were making their first ever appearance at the World Cup in 1982. But this time, they didn't have to play against each other to qualify. And more importantly, there wasn't a war. We often hear football fans joke about how football is more than a game and how it means war. But the next time you make that joke, just make sure you're not in Honduras or in El Salvador. That's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. And of course, if you're a football fan, send this to any football fans that you know. But if you happen to be from El Salvador or Honduras, drop a comment below.